I will destroy an illusion that you carry without knowing it. The illusion that communication can be perfect. That one day, with enough technology, with enough engineering, with enough intelligence, we will be able to transmit a message from one point to another without losing absolutely anything. Without any errors, without any distortion, without any failures. Total perfection. I'm very sorry, but that will never happen. Not because we lack competence, not because the technology is immature, but because the universe doesn't allow it. Imperfection is built into the fabric of reality, and I proved it mathematically. This is not a pessimistic statement. It's a physical statement, as physical as saying that nothing travels faster than light, as non-negotiable as saying that energy is conserved. The imperfection of communication is not a problem to be solved. It is a law to be understood. And when you really understand it, something extraordinary happens. You stop fighting the impossible and start working with the possible. And the possible, as I'll show you, is much more impressive than most people imagine. Let me start at the beginning. In the 1940s, at Bell Labs, I was surrounded by the best communications engineers in the world. Brilliant people, dedicated people, people who spent their days and nights trying to make their phones work better, the clearest connections, the fastest telegraphs, the clearest radio transmissions, and the enemies of all of them was the same: noise. That hiss on the line, that static on the radio, that distortion that made one word sound like another. Those mistakes that turned a clear message into an incomprehensible mess. Every engineer at Bell Labs struggled with noise. They tried more shielded cables, cleaner amps, sharper filters. Each improvement cost time, money, and sweat, and every improvement helped a little, but the noise never went away. Never! You could reduce it. It could push it to a very low level, but eliminate? Zero noise? Absolute silence on the channel? Impossible. And no one could explain why with mathematical precision. It was an empirical experience, a feeling of shared frustration. But it wasn't a law. It wasn't a theorem. It wasn't something you could write into an equation and prove. Until I did just that. What I discovered in 1948 can be summed up in a sentence that sounds simple but has devastating consequences. Every physical communication channel introduces noise, and that noise is an inherent property of matter and energy, not an engineering defect. You can't eliminate it because it comes from the same place as the signal. Of the electrons they transmit, of the molecules that vibrate, of the photons that float. The same physics that allows communication generates the noise that corrupts it. They are inseparable twins. Where there is signal, there is noise. Where there is communication, there is failure. Always. Let me show you why this is true on a fundamental level. Think of a copper wire carrying an electrical signal. The signal is a voltage variation, but the electrons inside the wire are not sitting still waiting for your orders. They move, they vibrate, they collide with atoms. This agitation is proportional to the temperature. The hotter the wire, the more the electrons bounce around. And this agitation creates random voltage variations. Thermal noise. It's the most fundamental noise there is. And the only way to eliminate it completely would be to cool the wire to absolute zero temperature. Zero temperature, 73.15 degrees Celsius. The lowest possible temperature, where all molecular agitation ceases. But here's the problem. Absolute zero is unattainable. The third law of thermodynamics guarantees this. You can get closer. It can cool a system to millionths of a degree above absolute zero. Labs do this, but getting to exactly zero? Impossible. There will always be a residual amount, however small, of thermal agitation, and therefore there will always be noise, not as a defect, as a property of the universe. A direct consequence of the fact that the temperature is never exactly zero, that particles are never perfectly still, that the universe is never perfectly still. And it's not just thermal noise. There is quantum noise. At the most fundamental level, quantum mechanics imposes an irreducible uncertainty on any measurement. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle says that you cannot simultaneously know, with absolute precision, the position and momentum of a particle. This uncertainty is not a limitation of our instruments. It's not a question of building a better detector or a more accurate sensor. It is a property of reality itself, a rule of the universe as inviolable as the speed of light, and it manifests itself as noise in any communication system that operates at the quantum level. Photons in a fiber optic cable, electrons in a transistor, spins on a magnetic memory. Everyone is subject to quantum fluctuations that are impossible to predict or eliminate. Even if you eliminated all thermal noise, cooling the system to absolute zero, which, as I said, is impossible according to the third law of thermodynamics, quantum noise would still remain. Irreducible, fundamental, permanent. A sentence from quantum mechanics that says, you will never measure a signal with infinite precision. There will always be a margin of uncertainty. There will always be an area where signal and noise get confused. There will always be potential errors that no technology, present or future, can eliminate. This means that zero noise is physically impossible, not practically impossible, physically impossible. Thermodynamics prohibits it. Quantum mechanics prohibits it. The most fundamental laws of the universe conspire to ensure that every communication channel is noiseless. And if every channel has noise, every transmission is imperfect. Every signal that travels from A to B arrives slightly different from what it left. Always, no exception, in any technology, at any time, in any universe that obeys the same physical laws as ours. Now I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, okay, the noise is there, but what about the error correction codes? Didn't Shannon himself prove that it is possible to transmit with an arbitrarily small error rate? Yes, I tried it. And this is one of the most misunderstood parts of my job. Because people hear arbitrarily small error rate and understand zero error rate. But it's not the same thing. Arbitrarily small means you can make the fee as small as you want. 1 error every million bits, 1 in every billion, 1 in every trillion, 1 for every absurdly large number you want to come up with. But 0? Never, never. Because to achieve exactly zero error rate, you would need infinitely long code. And infinitely long codes require infinite time to transmit, infinite memory to store, and infinite processing to decode. None of this exists in the real world. In the real world, all code has a finite length. All processing takes a finite time. Every memory has a finite capacity, and therefore every error rate is greater than zero, maybe microscopically greater than zero, so small that for all practical purposes it is indistinguishable from zero. But strictly, mathematically, formally, it is greater than zero. Perfection is an asymptote. You get closer forever, but you never arrive. Like a runner who halves the distance to the finish line with each step. Half, a room, an eighth, always closer, never there. And that goes for everything, not just for copper wires and radio waves. For every communication system that exists or may exist in the physical universe. Optical fiber? There is amplifier noise, photon scattering, imperfections in the material. Quantum communication? It has irreducible quantum noise and detector losses. Biological communication? Neurons fire with intrinsic variability. Synapses release neurotransmitters in fluctuating amounts. DNA? Replication has an error rate of approximately 1 in a billion base pairs per cycle. Very low, extraordinarily low, but not zero. Never zero. And want to know something fascinating? If the error rate of DNA replication was zero, we would not exist. Because without copying errors, there would be no mutations. Without mutations, there would be no genetic variation. Without genetic variation, there would be no natural selection. Without natural selection, there would be no evolution. And without evolution, there would be no human beings. There would be no animals. There would be no plants. There would be nothing but the first self-replicating molecules, copying themselves indefinitely, without change, without adaptation, without progress. The imperfection of genetic communication is literally the reason life as we know it exists. Error is not the enemy of life. It's her engine. It's what allowed simple molecules to become bacteria, bacteria to become fish, fish to become amphibians, amphibians to become mammals, mammals to become primates, and primates to become you, sitting there reading about information theory. Or because the DNA copy is not perfect. Or because there is noise in the genetic pipeline. This brings me to something that I consider deeply important. Imperfection is not just inevitable. She is necessary. She is productive. She is creative. In every complex system that works, from cells to civilizations, imperfection plays an essential role. It introduces variation. It creates space for the unexpected. It allows the new to emerge. A universe of perfect communication would be a static universe. No surprises, no news, no evolution, no creativity, lifeless. Think about human communication. When you talk to someone, the message that comes out of your mouth is not the same as the one that reaches the other person's ear. Some of it is lost in the air. Part of it is lost in the attention of the listener who is thinking about something else. Part gets lost in the difference in vocabulary, because the same word can mean different things to different people. Some of it is lost in interpretation, filtered by the experiences, prejudices, humor, and expectations of those who listen. What the other understands is always a modified version of what you said. Always. And sometimes this modification generates something better, an interpretation you hadn't thought of, a connection that was not in the original message, a new idea that is born from the space between what was said and what was understood. The art of conversation is made up of productive imperfections, of noises that generate unexpected meanings, of failures that turn into discoveries. The best dialogues in the history of philosophy, science, art were born from someone misunderstanding what someone else said, and, in that era, finding something new. How many times in the history of science has a discovery been born from an error? Penicillin was born from contamination. X-rays were born from an experiment that went wrong. The microwave was born from an engineer who noticed that the chocolate in his pocket had melted near a magnetron. Error is not the opposite of discovery. It is often the way for her. And this is true because error introduces the unexpected. Break the pattern. It forces the system to explore paths that would never be explored if everything worked perfectly. But I don't want to romanticize the mistake. I don't want you to think that mistakes are always good. In technical communication, mistakes are often destructive. A changed bit in an air traffic control system can be catastrophic. An error in a financial transaction can cost millions. Data corruption in a medical record can cost lives. The error is dangerous, and most of my work has been about combating it, how to minimize it, how to push it to such low levels that, in practice, it becomes insignificant. But fighting error is not eliminating it, it's managing it. And this is the distinction that defines all modern communications engineering. We do not pursue perfection. We pursue sufficiency. We ask, what error rate is tolerable for this application? And then we design the system to achieve that rate. For a voice call, an error rate of 1 in 1,000 may be tolerable. Your ear doesn't notice the difference. For a bank transfer, the fee needs to be astronomically lower. 1 error every trillion bits, perhaps. For communication with a probe on Mars, where relaying takes minutes, the rate needs to be almost infinitesimal. Each application sets its own standard of good enough. And engineering provides the tools to achieve this standard. Error correction codes, retransmission protocols, health checks, strategic redundancy. Each tool pushes the error rate a little lower, closer to zero, but never zero. The goal is not perfection. The goal is for the remaining imperfection to not matter. That it is so small, so rare, so unlikely, that for all intents and purposes, the system works as if it were perfect, even though it isn't. And this as if is the secret of all modern technology. Your cell phone doesn't transmit perfectly, but it conveys so well that you don't notice the mistakes. Your internet connection is not fault-free, but the flaws are fixed so quickly that you never see them. Your hard drive does not store data with absolute fidelity, but error correction codes built into the disk controller fix imperfections before they reach you. You live in a world of masked imperfection, of invisible errors, of flaws corrected before they were noticed. And this all works because of a fundamental acceptance that perfection is impossible. Because if engineers pursued absolute perfection, they would never build anything. They would be paralyzed, trying to eliminate the last residue of error, the last murmur of noise, the last quantum fluctuation. And they would never end, because this last residue is irremovable. Acceptance of imperfection is what allows action, which allows construction, which allows progress. This goes for engineering, and it applies to life. People who demand perfection from themselves, from others, from the systems they use, live in permanent frustration, because perfection does not exist. not in the absolute sense. What exists is the excellent, the extraordinarily good. Close enough to perfect that the difference doesn't matter. This exists, and it is achievable. But it first requires acceptance that the perfect itself is beyond reach. Now let me show you another dimension of this imperfection that most people don't consider. Communication is not faulty just because of noise on the channel. It's flawed because of the coding, from representation, of the inevitable translation between the idea and the symbol. When you have a thought and translate it into words, you are coding. It is transforming something continuous, multidimensional, rich in nuances, in something discrete, linear, limited by vocabulary and grammar. This translation is always a loss, always an approximation. You can never put an entire thought into words. There's always something left that words don't capture. An emotional nuance, an unconscious association, a texture of experience that simply doesn't fit into sentences. Language is an extraordinary tool, but it's a finite tool trying to capture infinite experiences. And the gap between experience and expression is permanent, irreducible, fundamental. It's the same logic that applies to digitalization. When you turn a continuous sound wave into a sequence of digital samples, you are coding. And every encoding of a continuous signal into a discrete signal loses information. The information that is between the samples, details that fall below resolution, the nuances that do not fit into the allocated number of bits. Coding is, by definition, an approximation, and approximations are, by definition, imperfect. So communication is flawed on two levels. At the channel level, noise corrupts the signal. At the coding level, representation approximates the message. Two different types of imperfection, both inevitable, both irremovable, both governed by the same theory. My theory. The theory that tells you exactly how much of each type of imperfection you can tolerate, how much you can correct, and where the limit is between the possible and the impossible. And when you add these two levels together, the conclusion is inescapable. Perfect communication would require a noiseless channel, which is physically impossible, and lossless coding, which is logically impossible for continuous signals represented by discrete symbols. Two impossible, two walls, and between them the immense and wonderful space of the almost perfect, extraordinarily good, of faithful enough. It is in this space that all human communication and all technology operates. This is the space we live in, that we connect, that we understand each other. Imperfect, but working. When I look at the world, I don't see imperfection as failure. I see it as a condition, the condition under which everything operates, the condition that physics imposes and engineering accepts. And within this condition, what humanity has built is astonishing. Billions of messages per second traveling the planet, each imperfect on some microscopic level, but each arriving intact enough to fulfill its function. Billions of conversations a day, each full of microscopic misunderstandings, but each connecting people in ways that matter. Billions of bits traveling between continents, through cables at the bottom of the oceans, through waves in the void of space, each bit vulnerable to noise, to error, to corruption, but each bit protected by codes that I have proven possible. The dance between imperfection and protection from imperfection is what moves the world. Perfection is impossible. That's a fact. But near perfection is possible, and near perfection is enough, and enough is extraordinary. Because enough built the internet, it connected humanity. It allowed probes on Mars to talk to Earth. It allowed you to hear the voice of someone 10,000 kilometers away, as if you were in the next room. All this done by imperfect systems. Noisy channels, finite codes, approximations upon approximations. Engineers who accepted the impossible and built the extraordinary within the space that remained. And yet it works. It works extraordinarily well, not despite the imperfection. Inside her, working with her, accepting it as the fundamental condition of any communication that has ever existed or will ever exist. Perfection is impossible. Thermodynamics says, quantum mechanics says, information theory says, 3 pillars of science pointing to the same conclusion. And that's exactly why what we've built is so impressive, because it was built not on the pursuit of perfection, but on the courageous acceptance that perfection will never come, and in the obstinate decision to build something extraordinary anyway.